But thanks everyone for being here, and for Jacob, Max, and others for organizing the workshop. Now, when we open our eyes, we don't just see a jumble of light or colorful patterns, but instead we see rich, discrete structures that we can think about and plan with, including objects with 3D shapes and physical properties. Let me see if I can point. Yeah, there you go. Like this picture, the glass, the liquid, this kid is pouring, scenes with navigable surfaces, events with temporally demarcated dynamics, agents with goals. We wish to understand that very basic aspect of our experience. How is it that perception transforms raw sense data arising from our physical environments into things like objects and people, into things that we can think about? To understand this core conceptual perceptual and cognitive machinery, we'll look at this whole scope from perception to cognition, from how we see objects, their compositions to scenes, their dynamics, which is forces and what they can do, and how we make goals and plans with them. Now, multiple fields and traditions have stake in understanding what gets us from perception to cognition, including the experience of perception and visual cognition in psychology, its cognitive, algorithmic, and representational basis in cognitive science, how perception is grounded in cortical signals in neuroscience, and how it can be realized in computation and machines in AI and data science. Now, in the work that I'll present today, we will start from cognition and cognitive theories and create this what we call multi-level computational models to move from middle to out. These models, these multi-level computational theories, are special because they are integrative, able to explain empirical measurements and phenomena across levels of analysis, from proper psychophysics to single-cell electrophysiology, all in the language of formal cognitive theories. The cognitive theory that I'll pursue today in this talk is centered around this idea of causal generative models, which are rooted, some in mathematical representation theory and a lot in computer science. To tell you what I mean by these things, I have to kind of take you to your childhood for a little bit to talk about this age-old practice of measuring the height of a child with a mark, with a graphite streak on the wall. Now, this representation of height has two key properties. First, it is structure preserving, meaning that the orderings of the marks on the wall preserve the orderings of the actual height of the child. And two, this is a behaviorally efficacious representation, meaning that it enables high reward actions back in the physical world. In this case, things like choosing appropriate clothing size for the kid or comparing the height of the child across time. Now, in the context of perception, to create these causal generative models, we will turn to computer graphics, which implements the abstractions of causes and causal processes out there in the physical world, including lights, materials, and objects, and how they can project the images, and how these objects move and react to external forces, with the central idea that causal generative models are like the glue of intelligence, the targets of sensory processing during perception, and what is sort of played forward during mental simulation and planning. Now, what we want to do is, with these multi-level computational theories, we want to execute this idea of causal generative models across levels of analysis, to link these cognitive theories on the neuroscience side, to link these cognitive theories to high-resolution neural data on one end, so as to explain neural mechanisms in terms of objects and generative models in ways that are uniquely functionally interpretable. And on the other end, to make contact with the broad psychophysics toolbox of the psychologist, including the flicker paradigm. Here I'm showing an example from a recent study that I'm not going to be talking about. And others by building what we call these multi-granular representations and goal-driven processing. Today, I'll present some recent work focused on the neuroscience side of things to really work out how these multi-level computational theories enable accounts of neural computation in the language of causal generative models. And hopefully, the studies will inform the conference, the workshop, the theme of the workshop, for they will relate intelligence across levels of analysis, from single cells, distributed and dynamic computation in neurons, to symbolic and structured representations in our minds. All right, so with that, in the first part, I'll talk about face and body perception to recover the algorithms by which these visual processes may be implemented in the macaque inferotemporal cortex, this high-level visual area in the brain, in the primate brain. And in the second part, I'll show some recent results in this relatively novel domain of soft object perception, suggesting that biological vision recruits into the physics. And I have a note here. Almost all of the studies that I'll be presenting are work under review. So if you want to get a copy of those things, just drop me a line. We have not been that big on preprinting our papers, so feel free to drop me a line. OK, now on to, and by the way, are we doing questions throughout the talk, or do we do that?
It's up to you.
It is up to me. I'll do it at the end, just to make sure that I go over the material. But if people have really pressing things, they can raise their hands. OK, now on to perception of faces and bodies. We are interested in object perception in general, but I'll start with faces. From a perception point of view, there is much information in faces that goes beyond just a person identity label. Consider this computer-animated face. It's someone you can't have familiarity with. Most of you probably haven't seen this particular individual before. But as you're watching it, you can see the momentary details of its three-dimensional shape and texture, the subtleties of expression, even some cues to health. And there's at least some evidence that the subjective feeling of seeing so much in the scene is psychologically broadly available. For example, humans can match visually presented faces to 3D printed sculptures that they can only touch but not see. In addition, from a neuroscience point of view, we have detailed knowledge of the regions involved in face processing, especially in the context of the macaque face patch system, this network of regions, which we will get to talk in a couple of slides. Faces are also an excellent testbed for developing and testing new theories of perception. It's a domain with multiple modeling traditions, and now I'm going to tell you about two of those. Now, each of these modeling traditions implement essentially alternative computational accounts of face processing, of how face processing might proceed in the brain. One of these objectives, one of these computational objectives, is to acquire high-level image statistics, such as the object category or identity information. Now, with the advance of deep neural networks, we can implement this perspective in neurally mappable models more easily than we could before, in, for example, standard deep convolutional neural networks trained to discriminate between facial identities. A different, second, distinct computational objective that vision is that vision may go beyond the sensitivity to high-level image statistics to also infer worldly causes that gave rise to sensory inputs, such as the 3D shape, texture, and expression of a face that is causally related to images through optics. Now, how can we implement this perspective? One clue comes from computer graphics. Computer graphics researchers create these graphics-based generative models to capture external data-generating processes of how view-invariant 3D scenes form and project to increasingly more view-dependent representations and ultimately to 2D images. Even though the goal of computer graphics is to capture external data-generating processes, several classic theories in neuroscience have posited that perception is about internalizing these external generative processes. So this is what we call the inverse graphics hypothesis, that biological vision may have internalized these computer graphics-like structure-preserving representations, structure-preserving behaviorally efficacious representations of how 3D scenes form and project to images, but in the reverse order. Now, this has been a good idea, but we really didn't know how to relate it to biology until recently. For example, we didn't know how to implement inverse graphics in neurally mappable models. Now, it turns out that the answer lies in a rather simple hypothesis, that if we train an inference network in an end-to-end fashion to map the outputs of the generative model back to the inputs of that same generative model, then the trained inference network will spontaneously acquire the reverse of that generative model, reverse of this graphics process. So to implement this, we will use the causal generative model to train a special kind of network, an inference network. Its architecture is by all means a standard deep convolutional neural network, with the distinction that it implements the computational objective of inferring scene-level causes. So we hypothesized when this thing is trained, its intermediate stages will reflect the reverse of the graphics process. Now, to test this, we will take a trained inference network and compare each of its layers to the key stages of the generative model. We will do that for the 3D scene stage, and we will do that for the 2.5D stage. And indeed, when we do that, we find that in this bottom-up hierarchy of this standard deep convolutional layer, this trained inference network, it arrives in this bottom-up hierarchy, it arrives at a 2.5D-like stage earlier than a 3D-like stage. And interestingly, both stages peak quite late in the hierarchy of the network, suggesting how far these representations are removed from raw images. Now, we believe this gives us a neurally plausible, mappable implementation of the inverse graphics hypothesis. And importantly, this network performs accurately on the task of inverse graphics. Here, I'm showing some input images to this network and its reconstructions. So this is from the original study we did back in 2020. The network at the time worked best with synthetic images. But here is a more recent version of this model, and you can see that on this held-out real-world images of all sorts, it shows reasonable success recovering the fine details of the face's 3D shape, texture, and expression. So it works for both synthesized and real-world images. So now, with this functioning and neurally mappable inverse graphics network at hand, we can test the neural data. As suggested, we will do so by comparing two reverse engineering models. We will compare the inverse graphics network with the VGG face network, for those of you who know, which implements this high-level image statistics in a powerful way. Now, let's talk about the neural data on which we will evaluate these models. These yellow patches on this inflated monkey brain shows a set of brain regions that starts all the way back on your brain and goes to roughly where your ears are. So these yellow patches are what is called face-selective regions. They are activated under fMRI more to images of faces than any other object category. Now, Winnick, Freiwald, and Doris Saw famously studied a sub-circuit of the face patch system using single-cell recordings from 3 of these regions in the macaque the cortex. In roughly the feed-forward hierarchy of MLMF, then to AL, then to AM. These are the abbreviations used to refer to these neural regions. They recorded from hundreds of neurons at each site, while the monkeys were presented with images of faces. 175 of them coming from 25 different identities and 7 poses. We will look at this data using representational similarity analysis, RSA. In this analysis, we take pairs of images from our stimulus set and their corresponding brain responses from a given brain region, which are summarized as vectors. We then take the normalized dot product of these vectors as a measure of their similarity, neural similarity. We do this for every pair of image we have, which gives us this similarity matrix. This particular pair of images would fall there on that matrix. And we then hierarchically organize the rows and the columns of this matrix by the poses, by the 7 poses and 25 identities in our data set. Now, Winrich and Doris discovered a systematic progression of tuning properties from MLMF, the most posterior, the earliest region in this network, IT network, showing view specificity. That is, pose pairs that are close to each other physically are also similar to each other, more similar to each other in this neural space. In Yale, they found something striking. Mirror symmetric poses, meaning a left profile phase, as you are looking at me, and the right profile phase, are more similar to each other in that region, despite the physical distance between them. And in AM, they found something even perhaps more striking, that is view robust identity coding, signature of which is this paradiagonal stripes, indicating that these neurons encode faces independently of the viewing angle. These similarity matrices are showing these remarkable transformations occurring along the IT cortex, but the question is, can we capture any of this structure with our models? This is the similarity matrices I was showing from the neural data, from this macaque face processing network. I'm also showing that we've quantified these qualitative observations I was making using what we call these idealized similarity matrices. Now, when we tested the inverse graphics model using the same stimuli as the monkeys saw, we found a really compelling correspondence between this model and the neural data. These F3, F4, F5 are just a consecutive a sequence of layers in this deep neural network matching the data best, which is quantified here by correlating the neural similarity matrices to model similarity matrices. And this full set of brain-like transformations emerge in this model with really high fidelity. Now, we also quantified the VGG face network in the same way, which showed qualitatively and quantitatively poorer fits. Most importantly, it skipped this intermediate mirror symmetry stage, directly becoming, more or less directly becoming view invariant. Now, these results provide support for the inverse graphics hypotheses. But more generally, they enable a uniquely functional interpretable vehicle for reverse engineering. That is, in the language of generative models and objects. In the specific case of the macaque face patch system, these results suggest a systems-level account of biological vision that starts in a 2D retinal image, ultimately culminates in the dimensions of shape and texture that describes a face as a 3D object, while passing through an intermediate 2.5D stage representing surface properties and a hidden nonlinearity in between. Now, we believe that these results establish some viability of the inverse graphics hypothesis that multi-area processing in the primate inferior temporal cortex implements the reverse of the generative models of how 3D scenes form and project to images. But the immediate next question we have been occupied with is to test whether this hypothesis could generalize beyond faces. Now, one approach we are taking to this generalization question is to test inverse graphics in the human brain, for which we need high spatiotemporal resolution data from the human brain. This is very much ongoing work, and I don't have any results to show. But be on the lookout for, I hope, an exciting new data source. As part of this project, we have been creating this large-scale ECOG data set, intracranial recordings in human epilepsy patients, that organizes data across about 4 decades of research into a usable database that it will enable testing of image-computable models of the brain in the human brain. But really, the place we have made actual progress on this question of generalization has been by studying the visual processing of bodies, body perception, which is what I'm going to talk about now. There are at least 2 good reasons to turn to bodies. First, bodies induce rich percepts when visually viewed, as rich as, if not richer than faces in terms of the posture and the pose of the body, its heading direction, the kinds of things that are important for us to understand others. And the second reason why we turned to body perception is that neuroanatomically, like faces, we know quite a bit about the macaque body processing network in the same inferior temporal cortex, especially in the context of these patches of neurons called MSP, the more posterior region, closer to the back of your brain, and ASP, the more anterior part of that node of this network. First, before talking about the neural data, let's talk about how we can create an inverse graphics network for the visual processing of bodies. As before, we start with a generative model that describes the body as an object in the dimensions of its 3D shape in a neutral pose and its posture, which is then projected to a kind of a 2.5D surface of an articulated viewpoint-dependent geometry, which is then ultimately projected to a 2D image plane features. Now, we followed the same recipe I mentioned for face processing to train an end-to-end deep convolutional neural network from images to latent variables in this generative model. And we confirmed that the intermediate stages of this model reverses the graphics process from 2D to 2.5D to ultimately 3D. And this model is, again, accurate at the task of inverse graphics. I'm showing some example reconstructions of human and monkey bodies with this model. So again, we have a functioning inverse graphics model that we will evaluate in neural data. But in this case, we will compare it to a broader range of models that acquire high-level image statistics, including unsupervised models such as SimClear and masked autoencoder, just the regular kind, and the standard models trained with supervision. We will test all of these models by comparing them to single-cell recordings from the macaque body patch system from ASP and MSP. The experiments are from Rufin Vogel's group at KU Leuven. They recorded from each of these body patches from about 100 neurons. And again, as we did for faces, we are going to look at that data using the representational similarity analysis. And we want to test our models in their ability to quantitatively explain these neural similarity matrices and the transformations between them. That's the neural data I was just showing from the macaque body patch network in the inferior temporal cortex. And these are the best matching layers from the inverse graphics network, which I hope you can appreciate the correspondence between the more posterior patch of MSP and this more convolutional layer in this neural network. And ASP, this more anterior region, and this FC1, a later layer of the inverse graphics network. Now, when we look at the best layers from across all of the alternative models that we tested, this is what we find. Not only qualitatively, it's a less compelling match, but also, as before, in these models, much like the face results, we skip an intermediate stage, this stage of MSP. I'll not dwell on this, but we have quantified these results that I'm describing in a number of ways, confirming these conclusions that I was just presenting. Now, these results, like face processing, provides a system-level account of how an image of a body is transformed into a percept of a body, but they also come together to suggest, at least to us, that inverse graphics may in fact be a canonical computation that organizes the networks of the inferior temporal cortex. Now let me do an interim summary. So far I gave you evidence that face and body perception in the inferior temporal cortex is better understood as reversing generative models of how 3D scenes form and project to images. Now, I didn't talk about how these generative models can be learned, how these approaches can be applied to generic objects beyond faces and bodies. And I think we will hear about a really interesting perspective on learning in a bit from Dan Yemens. But I told you about a general method for making these uniquely functionally interpretable accounts that are still predictively accurate models of neural computation via these new kinds of multi-level computational theories that in this case synthesizes causal generative models and deep neural networks. Now I'm going to move to the second part, and I'm going to see how I'm doing on time. I have time until
3:30.
3:50. Wait, 15.
3:30.
3:30. Oh, that's good. Okay. All right. That's excellent.
But that's the end, like including.
Yeah, hopefully we will do questions. But any questions so far? Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, how did you design your forward graphic model? Do you design that, or you just take that algorithm from someone else?
I think that's part of the kind of the framework to think about these structure-preserving mappings, right? This computer graphics, in this case, both generative models are in fact originated in data. So for both the face generative model and the body generative model, they are based on human scans. So there are important issues in terms of in biology how we learn those. But they are like in no sense of it arbitrary things, but they are in a close structural match with how bodies or faces work. So we start from basically off-the-shelf computer graphic setups and then operate from there on.
Did you compare different versions of this graphic model?
Yeah, I think we should, but I think under the theory, what matters is like as long as those different computer graphics ways of animating bodies and faces are like homomorphisms of each other, we will continue to see these kinds of results. Yeah. All right, I'll proceed to part 2, which will be shorter than part 1. Now I want to turn to this part 2 to talk about these physics-based representations in biological vision with a case study of soft object perception. Now let me start by pointing out something that's common between the two types of models I was just pitting against in the first part of the talk. And that is that they conceptualize vision as starting from inputs, as being based on inputs that originate on the object itself to be recognized. So the light bounces off of a surface, a face or a body, and arrives at your retina. And then some bottom-up processing or a bottom-up feature hierarchy leads to a percept. Now, what I want to do is I want to challenge that perspective by inviting you to look at this image and tell me what you see. So what do you see in that image? Yeah, you see a chair. That's very good. And how about this image? Okay, that's a good guess. It may be a computer screen, a box. Well, the category of this object is much less evident, much less clear. But the geometry, the shape of the object is equally evident in both of those images. And I just want to kind of make a demo here. If you entertain me for a moment, if you raise your hands and kind of up in the air gesture the shape of that object that is hard to recognize otherwise. Do it. What do you think the shape of the object is? Maybe draw the contours of the object? Yeah, okay, that's excellent. That's exactly right. So that's really an interesting case where the shape is equally evident, where the semantic information about the object is lost, but we have just as rich of a sense of the geometry of the object. And importantly, these percepts of objects come from an entity that is in fact entirely occluded from your view. Really, none of the luminance values arriving at your eye originates from the chair or this other object, but you still are able to perceive that shape. Now here we are going to ask, how can perception be possible here? And the answer to that we are going to pursue is that the brain represents and exploits the knowledge of the physical processes underlying the image formation, in a case study of cloths, to essentially see through the cloth. Now again, the field of computer graphics tools us with what we need to create working hypotheses for what a physics-based, simulation-based generative model of how cloth drapery works and how the scenes then project to images. In computation and psychophysical work, I've explored this possibility with my colleagues. Here I'm showing a couple citations. These studies provide behavioral evidence for these physics-based representations. But what I want to do today is I want to ask about the neural realism of physics-based representations during visual perception. And to do that, we are going to look at the cloth itself. As it moves in naturalistic ways, how do we perceive it? That is, how is it that we can tell whether the cloth is stiff like denim or soft like silk? And before I tell you this new fMRI experiment, let me introduce you to the two computational possibilities for how to solve this problem of soft object perception. Now, one possibility is much like the kinds of models that I talked in the first part, is a hierarchy of image features, which we are going to implement with a deep neural network trained to map animations of cloths to these latent properties of physical properties, in this case, stiffness and mass. Okay. And it turns out you can actually do that. Now, the second possibility is based on intuitive physics. The critical thing here is that this model aims to explain what is in the sensory inputs in terms of their underlying causes, a kind of analysis by synthesis, as inference or probabilistic inference in a causal generative model of cloth physics. We call this model woven, which defines prior distributions over external forces and physical properties by simulating a spring mass system, which at each time point is projected to image plane as depth fields. Now, this is the generative model, which we are going to visualize like that. Woven then is going to condition this generative model on sensory observations to perform inference. Like that. I'm going to show an example here, the inference trace of this model, as they are not quite synced, but you saw an inference trace as this model does its kind of fancy Kalman filter. Now, these are the two models put together here with some math to indicate that really what we are interested here is in these conditional distributions defined by these models, not the particular algorithms, especially in the case of woven, by which they may be implemented. So we are going to ask the posterior under a physics-based generative model, is that realized in the brain? And to keep ourselves honest, these models both happen to be pre-registered, maybe. We are using identical model simulations from our prior computational behavioral work in this area, which is under review. And again, I'll be happy to share these under review papers with people. Just feel free to drop me a line. Okay, now with these models at hand, we can talk about the fMRI experiment. So the stimuli used in this experiment consisted of 8 animations coming from 4 different scenarios: ramp, drape, rotate, and wind, and of 2 different kinds of cloth, a soft cloth and a stiff cloth. Participants saw these animations under the scanner, and crucially, during the experiment, we did not have any overt or explicit physics-related task. So what that means is we are looking at this spontaneous visual processing without any explicit tasks. In our analysis, we are going to look at the so-called physics region of interest, or physics ROI, which is a set of frontoparietal regions activated by an explicit physical reasoning task, as well as this region V1, which is an early processing stage in the visual ventral stream hierarchy. The first analysis that we did was to test for evidence of scenario invariant decoding of cloth stiffness in the brain by training a linear classifier on 3 of the 4 scenarios like that, and then testing it on the held-out scenario. And we did that for fMRI aficionados, experts. It is leave one C naught, leave one raw naught. So it is as proper as you can get, I think. And that's what we found. Both the physics region and V1 are successfully decodable in terms of this scenario invariant stiffness information. Now we have something interesting in our hands. Since both brain regions encode stiffness information to a similar extent, and certainly better than chance, does this mean that they encode analogous information about the cloth and its stiffness? To answer this question, we have to turn to computational models. And on the way, the first thing that we noticed that even though the averaging decoding accuracy in the physics ROI and V1 are basically the same, when we break down the data by scenario, we find that the rankings of the scenarios differed slightly between these two regions, suggesting that they arrived at that average perhaps through different routes. Now, this is the data, neural data from physics region and V1 I was just showing, and these are the model predictions. I hope that you can appreciate that there is a correspondence between woven and the physics ROI, and between the DNN and the V1 and V1. Models are like the exaggerated versions of the data. That's at least how they appear to us. And indeed, we find a double dissociation, with woven matching the physics ROI, but not the V1, and then the DNN matching V1, but not the physics ROI. I'll not go into details, but we confirm the same kind of double dissociation when we make other analysis here based on comparing what we call the stiffness similarity matrix of the brain regions and the models, together suggesting this double dissociation between the models and the two neural regions. Now, to summarize this part 2, as I promised that it was shorter, I provided evidence for the neural realism of physics-based representations during spontaneous visual processing. And that came with this surprising result of a double dissociation, suggesting that the brain deploys more than one computational code to solve vision. Now, there are two caveats with this study. First, I didn't provide an architecture that integrates both woven-like and DNN-like computations. And this is future work for us. But the second caveat is that I didn't actually say how woven can be implemented in the brain in a neurally mappable manner. Woven's implementation is, a software level thing, a probabilistic program for those of you who are interested. Now, before I finish, I want to point to a new direction in my lab that begins to address the second caveat on a smaller scale. Now, for this problem of compiling physics-based representations into neural networks, I don't think the strategy we took in part 1 of, in faces and bodies, of compiling via end-to-end training, I don't think that's as appealing here. Instead, it would be nice if we could just program our causal generative models into neural networks and then test them in neural data without ever needing the training part again. It turns out these things are closer to reality than you might think. We have been doing some work focusing on explaining the prefrontal cortex dynamics of macaques playing the video game of Pong. And the approach is based on extending a result from the physics of dynamical systems by Danny Bassett and Jason Kim. Now, in this approach, we start by stating a physics-based causal generative model in really symbolic terms, perhaps as a traditional high-level computer program. And Kim and Bassett's key idea is that these symbolic systems can be expressed as circuits of dynamical objects, circuits of ordinary differential equations, which then can be programmed into the weights and connectivity of a recurrent neural network. Now, the details of this method is outside the scope of this talk, but with this programmed RNN at hand, we can directly compare this RNN that, I mind you, we know that it implements this physics-based representation, it implements this mental simulation. We can compare it to neural data. And when we do that kind of analysis in a more than one way, we see consistency to neural data from that model, starting to address this question I have in the title of uncovering neural mechanisms of mental simulation. Okay, now that brings me to my conclusion, which I think is basically I provided you with this new class of models that we call multilevel computational theories, which yields accounts of neural computation grounded in cognitive theory. We worked this out in face and body processing, and for the physics-based representation in soft object perception. And finally, I ended by mentioning a broadening toolbox of multilevel theory building via programmable RNNs. I want to end by, before talking about questions, thanking my students and the three people who did the bulk of the work, Binyan B, who is a postdoc, Hakan Yilmaz in the middle, and Daniel Kalbeck. Thanks, everyone.